So welcome everybody to this meeting of talking about socialism from a Marxist point of view. It's being recorded and you can see it on YouTube at a later time. If anybody hasn't already subscribed, I'd ask you to subscribe on the YouTube. And I'm Soraya Lawrence. I'm welcoming you to this meeting. And on this date in 1895, Friedrich Engels died, an important figure in the history of Marxism. He actually, although not just from being in Manchester, but given that we are talking about Manchester tonight, he was working in Manchester, and it was the conditions that he saw of the working class where capitalism was its most obvious. At the time that he was there, he saw the violent exploitation of the working class, and in fact wrote his book "Conditions of the Working Class in England." And his conclusions from seeing that and his other life experience was not just the extreme exploitation of workers, but also the power of the working class, a new political power then, and how that class was capable of overthrowing capitalist system. And so I mention that because we are tonight very pleased to have Isaac Rose speaking. He's a tenant activist and author of a book, The Rentier City, Manchester and the Making of the Neoliberal Metropolis. Well, I won't speak of his book because he's going to speak to it, but it seems particularly pertinent that it's on this very day that Friedrich Engels died. So I would ask, I think everybody who's come in, anybody new, who's just come to the meeting, everybody is muted. I'd ask Isaac to introduce the discussion, what's happened in Manchester with a Manchester City Labour leadership, what's happened to the development and exploitation and the impact of that on the working class and working class community. And if Isaac, if you could introduce the discussion, not a lot of time, but 15 minutes, and I can let you know when 5 minutes before the end, if that helps you. Yeah.
Yeah, that's absolutely fine.
Great.
Yeah, so sorry, I haven't actually prepared anything in depth because my head's been completely in obviously all the horrible situations that are unfolding at the moment. But fortunately, I've done quite a few talks on the book now, so we can go forward. I actually didn't know it was Engel's birthday, so maybe that's quite a nice place to start off. So I suppose, yeah, the book, just if if you're not aware of what it is, it's basically a kind of monograph of Manchester as a city, both because the immediate prompt is because Manchester, if you know it, has had this quite kind of extraordinary property-led regeneration model done to it by the council over the last kind of 40 years, and particularly in the aftermath of the financial crisis. Massive change to the skyline and so on. Very kind of visible, very kind of dramatic, really, without really much parallel outside of London and Britain. So that's the sort of immediate kind of impetus for writing the book, and why I suppose Manchester is of interest now, because I think it allows us to sort of understand some of these more general universal processes and factors within Britain and more widely of the housing crisis, gentrification, and so on, through the lens of one city. So I sort of try and historicize that within the book, thinking about how how it was that Manchester's leadership, and under what conditions and with what techniques, embraced this model. And it sort of traces a sort of story since the 80s, and the way in which, I suppose, left or socialist routes out of kind of the crisis of social democracy and deindustrialization were basically blocked, by kind of resurgent new right in the mid 80s. Um, how this sort of emerged within the struggle in local government. Many will obviously be familiar with the story of the left local governments in the 80s and so on. But how in Manchester, what's really interesting is that the kind of same consistent leadership, basically, who had kind of come to power within the Labour Party as a sort of left opposition to cuts and austerity, and also for kind of gay liberation and racial justice and so on, as well as a sort of economic, platform of local economic democracy. How that leadership, after the defeat of the kind of rate capping rebellion in '85, and the wider defeat of, I suppose, what the book kind of talks about as like the new urban left. Obviously that's a broad term that also includes Sheffield, the militant in Liverpool, and the GLC, as well as other councils. That kind of left after the defeat of the miners is kind of defeated. Thatcher 7, we know the story. But what's very interesting is that in Manchester, this same leadership stay in place, or largely stay in place, and kind of turn on a dime, or do they? But they kind of they learn to embrace and master the techniques of sort of neoliberal urban governance, um, and really start to sing from the same hymn book as the kind of agendas that are coming out of Whitehall and out of kind of Thatcher's administration around things like enterprise zones, public-private partnerships, um, urban regeneration corporations, and so on. So the council in Manchester becomes very adept, at learning how to adapt, how to attract private capital into its projects. And I think initially these kind of start off, in line with kind of longer term strategic needs of the city, and over time you see, and the book kind of traces, and we can talk about this, how it looks at, for instance, the attempt to win the Olympics, obviously quite topical at the moment, and how the network of business leaders and local government figures who kind of coalesced around that leadership bid, around that Olympic bid, start to then bid for other things, and be a kind of dynamic but completely undemocratic force within the city, really having a big power over the direction of the city. So I kind of wanted to basically historicize, today's Manchester in that longer story of 40 years of neoliberalism, and the particular sort of path dependency of how that unfolded in Manchester. But kind of returning to Engels, obviously Manchester is a city with this kind of world historic importance as a sort of, primary site of industrial capitalism. Engels's analysis, not just of the productive sphere, or Marxist analysis of the productive sphere of capital, but Engels sort of starts to sketch out, the sphere of capital reproduction within space and within land and within housing. Obviously, he kind of talks about this within the condition of the working class in England, and he also then builds on it in 1872 with the housing question, where he talks about housing as a sort of secondary evil to the kind of factory system. And I kind of use those theories, but then, how they've been expanded by Marxists in the 20th century, particularly Marxist geographers, Harvey, Neil Smith, Doreen Massey, and kind of others, Henri Lefebvre, kind of thinking about this, switch, I suppose, of how capital is reproducing itself, and how it moves from the primary sphere of factory and commodity production, into a kind of secondary sphere of land speculation, rentierism, and so on, and housing. And I suppose that's the sort of the kind of macro frame of the book, is that, if we can think of Manchester as this sort of archetypical world, shock city of the industrial age, the kind of first industrial city where you can really, Marx obviously saw, had great insights by looking at the factory system in Manchester. Then perhaps today, building off this idea that Britain is now, a rentier economy, kind of rentier capitalism as the kind of primary form of how capital, big capital is moving through the economy, you can look at somewhere like Manchester, in particular, its housing and land, as almost like a sort of paradigm or kind of key case study for like the rentier capitalist era, and therefore hence the Rentier City, and that sort of that big switch, I suppose, that we can look at the aftermath of the 70s and so on, and this is obviously an argument put forward by Harvey and so on about capital switched largely from the primary sphere to the secondary sphere, so from production to kind of rentierism and real estate across the global north. That surely is a kind of a major sort of explanating framework for like why we see real estate bubbles, housing crises, and so on in cities like Manchester, but across the global north as well. So that kind of frames the book and kind of divides it. So the first section is called the primary circuit, the last section is the secondary circuit, and then the middle is this kind of interregnum where social democracy and also the industrial economy are collapsing, and there's these sort of alternative different. There's a political struggle over the shape of that throughout the 20th late 20th century, which is ultimately won by the neoliberals, giving rise to the world we have today. And yeah, I suppose really those are the big questions that maybe the book thinks about, but kind of uses the story of Manchester as a city to explore those questions and tell a narrative, really. But then I guess thinking about Engels, Manchester's always been a good place to think about some of these questions. Yeah, I mean, I can kind of leave it there and we can just have a discussion if anyone wants to ask about particular aspects of what I've said or so on. Really happy to go into detail about anything or more. Yeah.
Okay, all right. You had another 6 minutes, but that's right. So does anybody want to ask any questions? Will's got his hand up already. Yep, Will, fire away.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned the kind the what's happened to Manchester, particularly in the last 15 or 16 years, actually, which has been really rapid. It felt to me because I used to visit Manchester once a month for a work meeting, and just after 2008, there was a block of flats at the end of Oldham Street or a development that just stayed fixed. Nothing happened to it. It was actually like when I visited some countries of the south where they hadn't quite finished buildings and it just sat there empty. I often wonder what happened to that building. But I'm wondering, although it's specific to Manchester, right? And and I think that's really interesting. And I'm going to read the book because it sounds fascinating, to be honest. Do you think there is a previous city to Manchester? Would you compare it to London? And if not, why not? And what do you think? Who's next on the list of the great kind of rentier housing economy in the UK?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I wouldn't really compare it to London
Well,
that much.
sorry, Isaac. I think what I'm going to do is maybe take a couple of contributions, questions, and then call you in. Is that okay?
Absolutely fine.
So people have got time to sort of think and maybe add further questions on the same point. Is that yeah? Not wanting to cut you off at all. Okay, brilliant. Janet.
Yeah, thanks, Isaac. I've got a couple of questions at the end, but just a few words before then about my own experience, I guess. I was the chair of housing and the leader of a council that had 50% council housing of the whole stock in the city during the 80s, which I haven't read your book, but I've read things about it. And I'd agree with you that, looking at the 80s is critical in terms of where we are now. And just a little bit about Norwich, because it isn't like Manchester, obviously. And I think the only thing that is very similar is about the central factor of the right to buy and its impact then all the way through to now. So Norwich had something like 25,000 council properties in 1980, and it's now got something like 15,000. I left the Labour Party and I'm not anything to do with it, so I'm not totally up to date. And actually, if you look at those figures, and I did have a quick look today, the home ownership has hardly increased at all in the city. There's obviously been more housing association tenancies, but basically the gap has been made up by the private rented sector. And I think, you know, looking back, you could see what was happening in terms of residualization of council housing in plain sight, day by day. And because Norwich, and some of you have talked a little bit about this before, but Norwich had a very high quality housing, basically council housing. It had hardly any people on waiting lists. I'm not saying it was perfect, and I wasn't there then, but it was pretty good. And within a very short period of time, that had changed because of the right to buy and because of not being able to replace them and because of not having any money for modernisation. A lot of houses were built in the late 20s and the 30s. So more and more, it was concentrating poorer tenants in the existing council housing, which I guess what I mean by residualization. And I think there was some kind of feeling around, because housing was so important in Norwich politically. It had been a Labour council since, you know, 1890 or something, 1900. And housing was the centre of that, the focus of that you could feel a kind of draining away of collectivism, this concept of collectivism. Maybe I just thought that, but I'm sure that's true. Although I think even now there is some kind of memory in some tenants whose families have been on those estates since the 30s, that still remains, and I have some evidence of that. So although it's not like Manchester, it's certainly not like the London boroughs, we didn't have any of that stuff around, you know, the wholesale sale of estates and so on for lots of obvious reasons. I then worked in a think tank and a member national organisation. I'm afraid I had to work with lots of London boroughs. And I'm sure I don't have time. And I know you're saying Manchester and London were not the same, and I'd agree with that. But my experiences with boroughs like Southwark, working quite closely with them, are quite horrendous, and fit in very well, I think, with what happened in Southwark, in Haringey, in Hackney, in Barnet, with what will happen, I think, over the next 4 or 5 years with Labour. They are the same people. I mean, these people were leaders then, many of them are MPs or whatever. So I don't, you know, a lot of people will know what happened in those areas. I suppose the question really is, where is the opposition to this going to come? Is there going to be any electoral opposition through local government, through local elections? Will the Greens, for example, who are going to be probably the main challenges to in a lot of these places, including Norwich, to both Labour and Tory councils, will they, because we know they're not socialists, but they will presumably not be terribly happy, and haven't been terribly happy with large scale whatever you call it, gentrification or whatever. Is there any other way? And how do tenants organise? It seems to me it's not a very optimistic picture, and the private rented sector is no bed of roses, clearly. And whether there will be marginal reforms, or whether you think there may actually be significant reforms around the private rented sector. So those are the questions at the moment.
Thanks very much. What I'm doing, because this is a smaller meeting than normal, is giving people a little extra. So I can see that Barry has his hand up. and then Nick. Okay, Barry. If you unmute yourself, Barry. I don't know if I can do that. Nick, can you unmute Barry? That's it. Barry, you can speak. I can hear you if you speak.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'd like to thank Isaac for his book. I mean, certainly had an emotional connection with me. I lived in Moss Side in 1969. I also worked in a small print firm in the Royal Mill on Ancoats. And I also worked in Withy Grove, the printworks, when it was a printworks. And I also worked at the Daily Express and Ancoats. A lot of the issues that you explain in your book and the areas I'm very familiar with. I think your points about, going back to your book, your points about behind Manchester stood Mississippi is a really good point, because there are people who want to argue that and celebrate Manchester as the shock city, the image of Manchester and its mills as showing the world its technological future, and the idea that technology, capitalist technology, would sweep the world, bringing progress and civilization, when of course what happened was that it intensified old forms of exploitation, slavery in the Caribbean and in the southern states of America. I mean, some of the mills in the Manchester area were built with money made from families, slave owners in the Caribbean. And of course, slavery in the southern states, particularly Mississippi, fed the cotton boom in Manchester. And of course, elsewhere in the world, reactionary landed elites in Japan and Germany and elsewhere also latched onto capitalist technology and imposed it from above. So I think that's very important, that technology doesn't drive history. It's people that make history. And often people do focus too much on technological advance. Some of the points you make about that shock city, and of course we know their working class history. They opposed the mills, they burnt them down, they rioted, they smashed the machinery, and they weren't against technology as such. They were just against technology benefiting the few and not the many. And certainly Manchester was a pioneer in that sense in working class resistance. I learned about that in the Young Communist League in Manchester, the Communist Party in Manchester in 1966, 67. We used to worship Engels. He was some kind of god or idol. But in your book, I think you're very polite about Engels' view of the Irish in Little Ireland. You use a euphemism, I think, the phrase, his approach, his view of them was an essentializing caricature of the Irish. In other words, he had a racist view of the Irish at the time, saw them as living with pigs and living like pigs. And we shouldn't really try to hide that. Obviously, later Mary Burns and Irish republicanism, he changed and developed his views as Marxist as well. On your points about the interregnum, you refer to the interregnum between original liberalism and neoliberalism. But I think it's important to stress that there was still a massive capitalist input into that council housing. There was never genuine social housing in terms of the collective working class building something collectively and participating in the decision making. There was no real social housing. I worked in the Moss Side Hume housing office in the 80s, the Crescents. Now, we were able to give keys to homeless youngsters who wanted to leave home, couldn't afford rented, or were struggling with rented housing or were homeless. And we were able to give them the keys on the same day they appeared in the office, and we gave them a flat on the Crescents. One of the most satisfying things I've ever done in my job. But those were built, the Crescents were built with private contractors, big private contractors who took all kinds of shortcuts when they built them to make a lot of money. For example, they put dodgy chemicals into the cement to dry the cement sooner so they could make more profit and get the thing built sooner, which led to concrete cancer and defects in the building. And this was a common pattern in council housing. If you look at
sorry to interrupt you. If you can just wind up your remarks for the moment, not saying now immediately, but just if you can just bring that to.
Yeah, I thought you were giving people extra time, but anyway.
I'm giving people.
Yeah, okay, but
you've had 6 minutes, but that's fine. I am giving it's twice what everybody normally has.
Yeah, but I do think a chair should just judge whoever's speaking, and if you're repeating yourself or making irrelevant points.
Let's not discuss chairing, but if you finish what you're going to say
I'm going to finish now, thanks.
Okay, all right, thank you. Nick. Nick, you need to unmute yourself.
First of all, thanks, Isaac, for your introduction. Unfortunately, I've not read all of your book. I spent some of this afternoon, I read the first chapter, which is on the history, which was very engaging, and I think would be a brilliant introduction to anybody that wants to know the dual side of history of Manchester, as you put it, the radical working class struggle of resistance against the liberalism of the middle classes and the capitalist class, and how that's always been there. I've not yet got on to the rest of the book, so I'm not familiar with all of your arguments, but recently, having come back to Manchester from London, I mean, I've visited regularly over the decades, and you can see the change that's taking place in the centre of Manchester with all the massive tower blocks and so on, and you can see the Media City on the docks, and you can see the fancy apartments and stuff like that. So there's quite a visible change since I left in the mid-1970s. What I'm interested in is if you could develop what change, if any, you say has, or in your view, has happened in the rest of Manchester, in the as you go out from the centre, as you go out from the middle of Manchester, what's changed in the working class areas that surround and as they spread out. And some questions for you. So who has financed the change? Who owns Manchester? Where is the money going? And you make a point in your introduction about Manchester's got more renters than any other city. I think you say 61% of Manchester house dwellers are renting, and half of those, I think you say, are renting from private landlords. So who are those private landlords? And the other side of it, so going back to your first chapter, the radical resistance to what's taking place, it's links in with Janet's point. What evidence is there of a resistance to, I presume the private rent has meant that rents have increased and that it's made it more difficult, harder for people to survive. I know there's a massive student population, but I imagine that it's also hit, people that aren't transient, aren't students. So what's been the resistance from Manchester, and how do you draw any conclusions from that in terms of the rest of Britain? So there's some questions. Thank you.
Okay. I can't see any other hands up at the moment. So, Isaac, I'd ask you to, if you can, if you can just the points that have been raised, and touch on those and the questions. That would. I'm not saying you'd be able to do them all now, but if you could approach that, that'd be great.
Yeah, fine. I've fortunately took some notes, otherwise I wouldn't have remembered all these questions. Lots of questions. I'll just go through, what people have said. So, well, yeah, I mean, Janet kind of mentioned what I would say is my answer is that I think I wouldn't compare Manchester directly with London as a whole because of scale, but I think also the kind of, I guess, the complexity of the ruling class within London, that is much more layered and obviously much more powerful because the central state is based there. But also there's obviously like aristocratic power still there. There's like international capitalists, like, it's a centre of the world economy in a way that Manchester just isn't. As well as obviously political, military, and so on. Like the state has its power base there. So I think what's interesting about Manchester, I guess, and going back to the longer history, is obviously it was this liberal city. Like there's no kind of, because it was such a new city, really, as a city in the early 1800s. There's no like old power in the city, and I think this is kind of different even to somewhere like Leeds. And I've gone around the country to different places, and Leeds was quite interesting in that people were like, well, there was this kind of older agrarian bourgeoisie that, almost like agrarian based, but also merchant based, that was operating out of Leeds, kind of reaching into Yorkshire and that kind of farm. There's an older kind of form of power in the city that kind of maintained a grip over the city's kind of built environment and so on. Whereas Manchester, the shock city thing, the bourgeoisie kind of overthrew the aristocracy in Manchester, at least in the mid 19th century. And then you had this kind of liberal and radical thing, working class and middle class or capitalist class liberals kind of as the two powers. And then obviously with deindustrialization, that affects the city so profoundly because it was just, to a large extent, and also certainly the bigger region, like this kind of industrial region, massive deindustrialization. Whereas I think the character of London as a whole is like more complicated and different. Though I would say the kind of recent history, as Janet kind of said, I think London boroughs, Southwark, Newham, Haringey, have pursued policies really similar to Manchester. And it's kind of, I can't really work out whether they've kind of led and Manchester's followed, or whether Manchester has, I think in local government around Britain, in regional cities at least, Manchester is regarded as the sort of gold standard of how you do property-led regeneration. I guess Southwark and places have done the same kind of thing. So I think there are boroughs of London which are comparable, but then because they're situated within London as a whole, the character of what is done is slightly different. I think what's interesting about Manchester is, also it has that city centre that was, there weren't many people living in it because it was largely kind of ex-industrial or kind of warehousing or commercial space. So they've almost been allowed, and that's a fairly unique thing. They've had this big place to build new flats, and then the question that we've got now is how that is now impacting the inner city, the working class districts. So there are specificities about Manchester, which I think make it hard to exactly map onto anywhere else. And for instance, like a London borough, you've got people being moved in and around London and then moved out of London, relocations from council housing and so on, or estate demolitions. But I suppose there's that thing that London, I think it's probably reaching the saturation point, but there's an ability for the city to absorb some of this stuff. So yeah, there's a useful comparison, but I kind of think Manchester is better compared for reasons of scale with like other regional cities. I mean, I've going around the country, like the discussion in Glasgow, for instance, was extremely interesting, and quite comparable, although different. And Bristol as well was also kind of, everywhere's been different, but there are some places that feel like more useful comparisons, and I kind of feel London is to some extent a class of its own. In terms of, yeah, I mean, I haven't done an event in Norwich, so if anyone wants me to go to Norwich, I do actually really like Norwich, so I'd be up for a little trip. I didn't know about that 50% was council housing was the whole stock in the 80s. Yeah, I mean, the main question was around opposition, wasn't it? Yeah, so I think one thing on Right to Buy is just to say is that I think when I was talking about those packages of like right-wing reforms in urban politics, enterprise zones and so on, Right to Buy is clearly, obviously, absolutely central to what was done. And I think I kind of understand a lot of this stuff as like decomposing. The Thatcher administration was basically trying to break down oppositional bases of power within society, whether that was like council housing tenants or trade unions or local government, through all these tactics. In terms of like the opposition, I mean, I think the question of electoral opposition is pretty open. I mean, yeah, I think the Greens will take some of it. There have been some interesting Greens Green stuff in Manchester, but I generally don't think. I think their politics is pretty kind of all over the place often. I mean, I do think there should be more discussion about kind of independent left opposition. I mean, obviously we've had these 5 independents elected to Parliament, which is pretty unprecedented. And on a local scale, I mean, in Stockport, for instance, I think there's been a proliferation in Greater Manchester of these like hyper local electoral vehicles, which are often, right wing, probably, or kind of adjacent to the right. But I don't see why that couldn't be a tactic used by the left in certain wards where, for instance, there is major gentrification pressure, or so on. But yeah, it would take some kind of organisation. I think in terms of tenant action, I mean, I work for the Great Manchester Tenants Union, so I'm sort of in the middle of us and our network of branches. I mean, it is still small in the grand scheme of things, but growing. And I think, the emergence of these tenant groups across Britain and Ireland is quite an interesting development of the last 10 years. So you've got us in Manchester, you've got the London Renters Union in London, you've got kind of Living Rent in Scotland, CATU in Ireland, and Acorn kind of across England and Wales. And then there are a number of smaller kind of organisations in some English towns and cities. I mean, I think at this point, I've always been quite clear to stress like the relative weakness of these organisations, despite obviously working for one. We want to encourage thinking about our growth and our strength and so on. But I think as a model, as sort of like neighbourhood-based, independent, kind of working class led political action, it is one to pursue. And there's been lots of interesting conversations recently within the GMTU, particularly around anti-fascism and the role of tenants unions within that as well, looking back to some of the stuff that was done in the East End of London in the 30s, where there was the Stepney Tenant Defence League. So I think that all those kind of things are quite important. And I think with you mentioned, Janet, the push to liberalise planning and the government's agenda basically being taken out of the playbook of these London boroughs and Manchester, and I think that's absolutely correct. And something I've been going around saying to people is that you can also look at Manchester as a sort of model for like how Labour, this current incarnation of Labour, want to, they want little Manchesters everywhere, planning reform and get institutional capital into the private rented sector to kind of rebuild Britain. Unless there's independent opposition to that, it will kind of steamroller through. But I think it's a kind of fertile ground for organisation if the left get organised over it, basically. And I think through democratic organisations as well. And that's one of the interesting things about the tenants movement is that, and the CATU in Ireland have written quite interesting, some people in there have written interesting stuff about how that model of a kind of democratic member organisation was sort of settled on by housing campaigners in Ireland who had kind of fought, like, if they were single issue campaigns or just, you know, housing action committees and things like that, but also wider fights over, you know, anti-privatisation and other things like that. That there was a kind of realization that we had to build democratic organisations with the capability of long-term sustained organisation. Obviously not a new discovery, but a very old one. But I think kind of interesting that there's been a turn back to that.
And have
Yeah.
you, sorry to interrupt you, has there been a discussion about how to go beyond? Are there any wider conclusions that are being drawn about the fact that it's capitalism that's causing the problems, and that whilst you've got to fight for local, I say local tenants' rights and so forth, and better housing, that any sort of wider conclusions about the fact that it's the system that creates the position that we're in terms of housing?
I would say in pockets, but like as an organised, you know, attempt to raise to that level of consciousness within the tenants movement, I don't really think it's there at the moment. Not to say that I don't think it could be there, or that there's the potential to raise it to that level, but I sort of think that's yet to happen, to be honest, beyond like individuals and maybe small pockets of people involved. But like as a systemic thing within the organised movement of tenants across Britain, I don't think that's really the horizon at the moment.
Okay, I'm just going to cut across you. I'm just going to, Minnie's got her hand up, so I'm going to call Minnie in, and we'll take it from there. Thank you. Thanks, Isaac. Hi, Minnie. You unmute yourself. We can't hear you.
Oh, I pressed, but it didn't depress.
Okay.
Oh, thanks for that, Isaac. Just to say, just got a bit of scribble here. First of all, there used to be an office for fair rent in this country. There used to be the laws for fair rent. I think that was abolished under, was it late Thatcher or early Blair? I can't remember.
It was the Housing Act, I think, so late Thatcher.
Yeah, I thought it was late Thatcher, but yeah. And then there's a thing at the moment that if flats go up on the market, that there's a bidding war, and that landlords involve people in bidding wars, and Labour Party is coming up with some new legislation to stop that. But I've heard, I don't know what you've heard, so this is one of my questions, that there's a massive loophole in that they say, well, you know, if individuals do want to put a bid in, we're not going to stop them, but we're going to stop landlords, you know, so that looks like it's a dud, like everything else. Also, yeah, I think there's an expansion, obviously, of the rentier mindset, and it's really promoting and expanding the capitalist, you know, the kind of mind rot, really. So even people who are really a bit strapped for cash, they'll desperately try and get a mortgage and buy another property so they can stuff it with students, or, you know, or maybe make a bail hospital so they get regular money from the government, and so then they can give up work and just sit back and just exploit other people. So it's like an expansion of exploitation. Hey, it's a good thing. And housing as banks as well. I mean, it's just crazy. For example, I know people who bought a house in Liverpool for 30,000 in the late 90s, and they did it up recently and sold it for nearly 800,000. I mean, it's absolutely crazy how people cash in like this, and how what easy money is. Also, yeah, what is there? Yeah, housing associations. I think I've heard people start to refer to them as banks, basically. Like banks, they're making loads of money. also about Labour's recent, house building programme. Well, there's no in-house construction. There's no public construction. It's all about the private sector. And I know that big nasty corporations like BlackRock, does it own 40% of the land in Ukraine now? I think something like that. And they're asking the Ukrainians not to bury their dead on their land. But I know BlackRock are getting involved in housing markets, and they're expanding in the US, and they're coming over here. Hey, great. More bubblegum. Caused a lot of saliva, that. And then I just want to ask you another question. What sort of rights do you think that renters should have? Obviously, surely people can't, there's certain behaviours that people can't get away with without, with causing their neighbours or what have you. Yeah, and obviously the rich are putting their money in assets. So that's just spiking housing prices, isn't it? And also round here, I know there's a lot of student housing, there's HMOs everywhere, and the public services aren't there to match that. But also you've got like rabbit hutches with no greenery around and lots of concrete, and they're like echo chambers, rabbit hutches and echo chambers. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Minnie. So before I call anybody back in who's wanting to speak again, I've got Toby, Kirsty, Virginia, John Henry, John Pearson. Anybody want to ask any questions, say anything, post something to ask a question or to comment? If doesn't have to be a long question, just so that you're participating in the meeting. Obviously participating means listening as well. I think Virginia, you have your hand up. Can you? Yes, brilliant, great, fire away.
Sorry, I missed a good part of this. I had to leave in the middle. And so I don't know what was discussed, but I downloaded the book and I'm keen to read it. And I also wondered whether Isaac was familiar with the London Federation of Tenants. Does he know anything about that? And I wonder if he could just fill me in a bit more on, I live in a sheltered housing building, and we are concerned, like many people, about the rising rental and additional costs. And there's a sheltered housing forum, and well, he'll know what the situation is with the organizations, which is really what my question is about. If he would kindly sort of let me know about tenants organizations in London, or give me, links to, so I could find out interesting things about them that he might think are interesting.
Thank you very much, Virginia. Toby, the two Johns, Kirsty, any? Toby, do you want to make any sort of comparisons or draw in any experience of housing in Italy? I lived there such a long time ago that I would very much hope that it's the conditions have changed, but it was virtually impossible in those days to rent. So most people ended up overcrowded, still living in the family home in very difficult conditions. But I don't know. John, well, John Henry's got his you don't have to turn your screen on if you want to speak, John Henry. John Pearson. Okay. Minnie, I can see, is that your hand still up from the last time? No, you want to speak again, or? There's a hand, okay, it's gone. Okay. All right.
Yes, sorry, just a quick one, Chair. I just wanted to say about, what was it, about the Oh, it's okay, I've forgotten now. Sorry, I'm like a rabbit in headlights.
Take your time, yeah, when you remember, there's no problem. There's not a Barry, did you want to come back in? I can't hear you. Was that you're muted, so if you do want to come back in, unmute yourself. Yeah. Oh no, it's gone again. Unmute yourself. Okay, if you speak now, we'd be able to hear you.
It's okay.
Oh, right, okay. All right. Anybody else want any more questions before I ask? Will?
Yeah,
Oh,
sorry.
Will, sorry. I can see Minnie's waving her hand and I'm going to call her before she forgets what she was going to.
Sorry, yeah, just a quick one. It was about, I heard that the affordable housing, which obviously isn't affordable, and a lot of it is lying empty because people can't afford to buy it. Oh, thanks.
Okay, thanks. Will, very sorry about that.
All right.
Okay.
See, I think that the main thought I have is that really the connection that Isaac was talking about in terms of what Labour did in the city of Manchester and also in Southwark. Actually, I think there are similarities there, and some of the other places. They're going to basically visit it on the rest of the country as their election program. Yeah, and I mean, I thought it was funny that the Daily Mirror had Council House Revolution on its front page. It's kind of Orwellism to the most extreme degree. Really, it's going to be completely the opposite. And so the stuff that Rayner was talking about, overhaul of the planning system, review of the green belt. Every area must have local housing plans. Well, they do, but some of them are massively out of date anyway. I think it's just going to be a developer's charter. That's what we're going to see, and they're going to let all this stuff let rip. And if you look at the government announcement that they put on their website and sort of speaking about how they're going to build homes, they don't challenge the notion of affordability, which we know is non-affordable. They don't say anything about that really. Their main view is the developer's view, is what's been going on for some time in terms of the political logic, which is that if you build more houses and the prices will come down, right? That's what they say. That's the PR approach. But actually, that's not true. That's just not true, and they don't. And, the developers have a lock on governments unless they're opposed by a government that's prepared to oppose them. And so what we're going to see basically from Rayner is exactly the same stuff that we saw Labour councils do in places like Manchester and Southwark and other places, and it's going to be absolutely dreadful. If you look at the statement they put out and the stakeholders that welcomed Rayner's statement, you start with Neil Jefferson, he's from the Home Builders Federation. You then have the Royal Town Planning Institute, and then you have Polly Neat from Shelter. They made sure that a applicable NGO was close to the top of the press list so that they could get the ticks from their board members. But as you go further down, right, you're just looking at the British building industry saying we support what Labour is doing. And there's quite obvious, I mean, it's like Granger, it's people like Legal and General, it's Berkeley Homes. I mean, Berkeley Homes are completely rancid when it comes to their developments and their work on so-called affordable housing. And so what we'll have them forcing councils to deliver so many houses, which is what we've got now. And because it's only the private sector that can deliver it, the private sector will argue down the number of social homes and affordable rents. And you start off with a development which is 1,000 and it says we'll have 100. And then they'll do a viability assessment and say, oh, sorry, it's got to be 10. Sorry about that. And I think we're going to see that all over the country. And I think the use by the Labour Party of the notion of social housing is because we've all stopped saying council housing. They're quite happy with all stop saying council housing, because social housing is something different. It's not council housing. And also the social housing organisations. I mean, if they were quoted on the stock market, they'd be absolutely massive. These are huge organisations that are finding ways of booting out the less desirable tenants and keeping the most desirable tenants. So really, it's not going to be, there'll be no change at all. In fact, it may be, I find it hard to say this. Well, I don't find it hard to say it. It may be hard, it may be worse under Labour than it was under bloody Tories, because Labour have got a driven plan now, and they've got their own little group of MPs. I don't know whether people have noticed this, the Labour Growth Group, which has got about 50 people signed up to it, who are probably arch, you know, well, March Blairites, but I don't know what we call them anymore. And they've written to the Prime Minister welcoming the strategy and saying that we're writing to you to make it clear that it's in the national interest to start delivering on our manifesto promise, including 1.5 million homes across Parliament at the earliest opportunity, by backing the builders, not the blockers. So we're going to go through a process of massive deregulation. Right now, this might feel a bit funny if you're looking at people on the Greenbelt. I mean, I actually live on the where I live on the Greenbelt, right? It's outside of London, and you get on my local Facebook group when they say they're going to build 10 houses down the road, there's bloody uproar, right? And you say to people, well, you know, actually, you live in one of these new houses. It was just a new house 20 years ago. So there's a Labour might have some fun with kind of taking revenge on the countryside by building houses across it. But make no mistake, none of this is going to be the interest of the working class. None of it at all. And also what they might do is what I think Islington took to doing, which is infill, huge amounts of infill in grey, what they'll call grey land, I think, where they were building stuff on previous council estates to raise the council's social housing council stock and making the whole area unlivable. So I don't. It really doesn't look good. And of course, what Labour is doing is channeling. I mean, and this is kind of what I was thinking. Isaac, I had a question to you about who is it? Where's the money coming into Manchester from? Because I know that globally there are global organisations that will set aside money. You know, so in London they set aside 300 million, one of them, not to build or buy expensive flats or to build expensive flats, but to start buying up pre-built properties as investment opportunities. Yeah.
Okay.
So if anything, the housing crisis is going to get worse rather than better. And a kind of a socialist response to it in some form. And I understand the point about tenants organizations. They're cross, you know, they're not socialist organizations, and they couldn't be, yeah. But you need a kind of a crystallization of a socialist housing policy that can actually attack Labour and what it's doing and make people realize that sometimes the Daily Mirror, when it says council house revolution, is not quite speaking the truth.
Thanks, Will. But Nick, before I call you in, I'm just going to read, Kirsty's posted, Mary Barber was the Red Clydeside movement in the 20th century in Glasgow and kept the rents down in Glasgow then. Is that the same as Manchester renters? So that's a question for you, Isaac. Nick, I'll call you back in and yeah. Unmute yourself.
Yeah, so Isaac, just wanted to return to one of the points that I was asking earlier, and it follows on from what Will was saying. I think, I don't know if I mentioned it in the meeting, but I've just moved back to Manchester after a sojourn to London that has lasted 45 years. But I lived in Southwark, which is one of the councils that you mentioned, and it was Labour for pretty much most of the time that I lived in it, and it was appalling, and it is appalling. And it used to boast about the housing that it was producing, which you could number essentially on your fingers and feet. And it used to boast about the social housing, which was almost non-existent. But what happened, as you and everybody else on the call will know, that massive estates were demolished. Council estates were demolished and basically handed over, the areas were handed over to private developers, and they negotiated and wheedled and backed down and cut the number of so-called affordable properties so that they were almost insignificant. You had the building of properties where, you know, you had some of the properties were inaccessible to some of the other parts of the building because they were, you know, they were the social housing parts, and the others were for the posh, expensive apartments. So I'm presuming that that's happened in Manchester, and that council estates have pretty much gone by the board. So if you've got any information about that. I mentioned it earlier about the massive, I suppose, the transformation of some of these old Victorian 19th century warehouses and so on into swish apartments. So who's living in them? Where is the money coming from? Where's the money for the investment coming from? It does seem to me that at some stage, this is going to be a massive bubble that's going to burst, is it not? And what's going to happen then? In Southwark, what you've seen, and Minnie's point, and I suppose it's every big town, the housing stock, as the prices have gone through the roof. Not just doubled, but tripled in the last, say, 20 years. And working class young people cannot afford to move into their own area. And so you've had a lot of people moving out into Essex or Kent, which I suppose just exacerbates the housing question there. But has the same thing happened in Manchester? And so the question is, where's the money for the development coming from? And how do you see that continuing? Or do you see a point when that comes to an end? Thank you.
Thanks, Nick. Anybody else want to come back in before I call Isaac to sort of round things up? No, Will.
Just to say that actually what you see in Manchester and in Southwark and other places, and the compare and contrast is interesting to do. I agree with the points you made about that, Isaac. You know, this is a global phenomena. All over the world, cities are going through, in one degree or another, are going through this process. Everywhere, they're going through this process. And global capital is ruthlessly, like it's stripping out lots of different parts of the world in lots of different sectors of the economy, whether it be fishing or it be water ownership or whatever it is. Yeah, they are absolutely focused on housing and buying up huge lots of land, and it's a long-term lease investment program. Really, it's leasing. Really, they have the house and then you have to lease it off them. That's what, you know, one way or another, either through a mortgage company or it's through rent or whatever. But this, the point you were making about the crash, Nick, I think is really interesting, and China is worth looking at this because they had housing. They did exactly the same thing. The so-called Communist Party did exactly the same thing in China as happening, and they built like mad. And they've now got several major housing corporations that they're having to slowly manage their bankruptcy of. Really, that's what's going on. They completely overbuilt. So I think the thing is that it's right to kind of have a focus like Manchester and think about London, but actually these are global monsters we're dealing with here that are driving this stuff, in my view.
Thanks, Will. So just a comment from Minnie and Graham. A lot of luxury flats and other flats built in Liverpool are lying empty. Kirsty, not enough housing built either for accessible housing as well, especially in Glasgow and Paisley. And Nick, very briefly.
Okay, so I just wanted to, I meant to say in response to Isaac, or to come in to try and develop one of the points about programme. Bearing in mind, I don't think that there's a national solution to the capitalist crisis, and we've got to look internationally and primarily in the first instance towards Europe. But surely housing is a prime example of where collective ownership, okay, so collective ownership of the housing stock allocated on the basis of need, developed, as Barry mentioned, in coordination with the needs of the people that are going to live there. And that would mean, would it not, that we would have to have collective ownership of the big building companies, the big building corporations. Local authorities used to have direct works. They've all been destroyed, wound up, so I don't think they exist anywhere. But surely one of part of a program to resolve the housing question is partly building, yes, but I think more refitting. But if we are going to do either building or refitting, why should we be putting our money into the hands of the private corporations that Will's mentioned and making them even richer? Because they're only going to build what they can make a profit out of. If their target is 1,000 and they say, well, we can make a profit out of 100, then they'll build 100. They won't build 1,000, they'll build 100. And they will call the tune. Whereas whatever is needed on a national basis, allocated locally or regionally, which should be worked out in conjunction with the local population. If we had control of the resources, that is the land, the machinery, the equipment, the skills, if we collectively owned all of that and planned it, then that would go a long way in conjunction with other aspects of the economy towards showing how we could actually tackle a housing crisis, which is there only for the interests of big business and the big landlords.
Thanks, Nick. Okay, so just Virginia, Isaac has posted on the chat. Are you able to see the chat? If you look at the buttons on the bottom, there is one that is actually I'm trying to see where it says chat.
Under the more button.
Under the more, is it? Okay. And it's yes, and then you can click on chat and you can see the chat. London Renters Union, Housing Action Southwark and Lambeth, and then there's London Tenants Org. Can you see that?
Thank you very much.
Okay. Okay, so Isaac, can I ask you to I know it's difficult, but if you can deal with all of that in about 12 minutes, that would be great.
All right, I'll give it my best shot. Thanks. I mean, really great discussion. So I guess I'll start with Nick's questions because I think they will also help answer some of the others. So who owns Manchester? So I think what's really interesting about Manchester is that in 79, I think it was about 80% of the city's land was owned by the council itself. And that was a product of largely the sum clearance programs of the mid-20th century. The council CPO'd massive areas of the city. What's happened since then is obviously a lot of that land has been parcelled off, sold off, and often with the council using it strategically to kickstart development in certain areas of the city where they, well, more recently since the crash, partnered with private finance and institutional capital to do so, kind of in the aftermath of austerity. Government money was less available, so in Manchester, there's Abu Dhabi United Group, who bought the football club, have had an influence there's a group called Manchester Life, which is a partnership between the council and Abu Dhabi. There's one called the Far East Consortium, which is in North Manchester in Collyhurst, which again the council and public land from Network Rail has been packaged together, partnered with private capital to build 15,000 housing units, most of which will be private, some of which will be so-called affordable, subject to viability in the kind of, as the saying goes. So I think that gives you a kind of a sense of how the finances increasingly also since the crash coming from institutional capital, particularly within the build to rent sector. So that's, you know, blocks of housing that's being built as permanent rental assets by the institution that owns it, rather than being sold off for sale or individual landlord. 50%, well, research done kind of a few years ago showed 50% of the units in blocks over, I think it's 4 stories or over 20 units, built or given planning permission since the crash up to 2020, 50% of that was built to rent. And, you know, that is where institutional capital is really interested, because it's a permanent asset that you can own and take an income off kind of in perpetuity. And that's the story of the last 15 years, 10 years, is an increasing integration of Manchester with global capital. Before then, I think there was much more like local capital from local business people out of the music industry and so on. But the financial crisis, as it has across the world, changed the character of this, because the wealthy were increasingly interested in kind of assets and housing and land. So that is obviously a global story as well. The money, yeah, I guess in those situations, the money's going offshore into these asset managers. As well as sovereign wealth funds, there are things like pension funds, big American pension funds, Australian pension funds, German pension funds, all kind of investing in Manchester property, as they are in kind of this kind of built-to-rent property in Britain more widely. In terms of estate demolition, I think the Collyhurst example is really pertinent, and North Manchester. Just this morning, I was working with some tenants there and residents who are under threat of demolition. It's not happened as much in Manchester as, say, London, mainly because there was all that land in the centre, the commercial land, where there weren't estates that needed to be demolished, with the exception of what they did in Ancoats with the Cardroom estate as a big major demolition, where Urban Splash were kind of handed this estate, demolished it, and built this kind of waterside marina where there's now lots of yuppie flats, as well as old warehouses and mills turned into apartments. All of this is about attracting a kind of higher income resident. A lot of Manchester's economic strategy has been about retaining the graduates, because Manchester has a massive university population, 2 huge universities. That's at the kind of core of the economic strategy for the city, is kind of retaining that kind of graduate and professional employment. So a lot of this housing is kind of aimed at them. In terms of like, yeah, out of the city centre in the kind of working class districts, I think it kind of changes the different sides of the city. So in the south, kind of Hume, Moss Side, Ardwick, the university and the students are major players in kind of gentrification pressure, whether that's like students, private landlords turning their homes, you know, buying houses and turning them into HMO lets or Airbnbs for students, or big capital investing in purpose-built student accommodation, or the universities themselves like buying up areas and building new campuses and so on. That's the kind of, I think, the main character of the south of the city, and that's led, and because it's more private rented there, that's led to rent rises, because there's no controls over rent rises in this country. In the east and the north, there's been more of this kind of direct state-led gentrification. I think that's probably because there's less like private capital. There's not enough private capital circulating in those areas to kind of kickstart a gentrification regeneration program. So the state, the local state, and this is obviously the story in London as well, in places like Southwark, the local state becomes a really important partner in kind of state-led gentrification, social cleansing, and so on. It's definitely true that there are people on those estates. You know, I know one woman who can trace her family back 200 years in Collyhurst, and her grandchildren can't live in the area because there's nowhere to live cheaply. So that is certainly happening, and I think that's going to happen more and more, because the city centre is basically reaching a sort of saturation point where these dynamics are going to expand into the inner city. in terms of, I guess, yeah, I guess the main other point that I think was, I mean, there were lots of specific questions, but I think the main other thing that I think is really interesting. Well, actually, well, one point I think, Barry, you talked about the stuff about slavery, and pulling that out, and thanks for your very kind comments on the book. I think that one of the reasons I thought, obviously we need to think about this in the formation of British capital, but also I think there's a narrative that you could tell about contemporary Manchester or even like contemporary Britain, where international capital has suddenly got very interested in Manchester. But actually, if you take these longer views, in a way, it's a reassertion of these much older kind of imperial networks of capital circulation. So like Abu Dhabi and Britain have a long relationship through the British Empire. The Abu Dhabi regime's relationship with Britain is a kind of product of those longer histories. So the relationship between Abu Dhabi and Manchester today is a sort of reassertion of some of these deep structures, I guess, in the global economy. So yeah, it's that kind of longer story of the city being kind of linked into the global economy. I guess to just finish, maybe, which is really the question about Labour's agenda, and what you were saying, Will. I mean, I think your analysis is completely correct. I don't think the left have been very good at saying what you just said. I think people have got very confused about the arguments around supply, and allowed, a set of bad actors essentially to frame this argument about, well, the solution to the housing crisis is to have a radical expansion in supply. It doesn't really matter what supply you have, and obviously we've seen these kind of NIMBYs v YIMBYs things pop up, which I just think are just a kind of sideshow to what are the real solutions to this kind of stuff, which is public housing and rent controls and so on, and decommodifying housing. And I just think Labour's policy at the moment has been completely captured by the developer lobby and the private house building companies. I mean, Reeves is saying that private capital will rebuild Britain. Housing will be a main part of that. I think this is just going to expand these dynamics of rentierism in the economy, more and more of people's wages going off in rent offshore into BlackRock or whoever. And if you look at the total package of reforms, I mean, they are obviously promising some reforms over the private rented sector around Section 21, and there's some things around bidding wars and things that obviously, as has been said, there are many loopholes. But I think the total package is probably to make a more professionalised private rented sector. So get rid of that kind of bad rep, small time landlord, which has become the kind of folk bogeyman, and move the private rented sector more towards like institutional capital owning properties. I think if we have a private house, if we have a house price crash or something, organisations like BlackRock will move in to buy large amounts of like small time landlords. I think this has happened in other places around the world where there's a kind of consolidation of the private rented sector and the kind of removal of these kind of mom and pop landlords into more like institutional ownership of housing. I think we already see it in some places like temporary accommodation. But I think, I mean, the big capital is ready and ready to take advantage of this, and I think very well integrated within the Labour Party. I don't think it's any surprise really that the Labour Party would have those links, because obviously in local government they work with these people all the time, and those kind of right wing elements of local government are basically running the party now. So yeah, I think it's a very developer friendly agenda. I guess. Yeah, I do think, Will, we need a crystallisation of socialist housing policy. I think the book ends on some kind of similar note. I don't think the tenants' unions on their own are going to be able to do this because, as you say, they're unions. There needs to be like a political front around this as well. I generally think the left could get a lot better at thinking about these kind of issues and pushing stuff around it, which is partly why I wrote the book, basically. Yeah, I'm sorry if I've missed things people have said, but hopefully that's kind of been sweep that's caught most of it.
No, thank you. That's fantastic. Thank you so much, and thank you so much for coming to speak. It's it is, yeah, excellent. Thank you very much indeed. Just sort of to come round, the one of the strands, I think, from the discussion is that, of course, you have to have people getting together in tenants' organisations and so forth to fight for better conditions and so on, that you can't resolve the housing problem without tackling capitalism. And so coming round to the when I lived in Italy, and I know we haven't heard from Toby, but perhaps on another occasion, there had been big successes in legislation to improve conditions and rights of tenants. And the result was that because the communists didn't own the property, and because it was in the hands of landowners and capitalists, what they did was they did a sort of rental strike. So essentially, you couldn't find anywhere to rent because you had to meet this massive criterion of anyway, money, etc., etc., and so they just didn't rent out, and that was a sort of a conundrum that the political party, when I say the political parties, the left, the socialists and the communists, did not approach in terms of, well, actually, the conclusion is you've got to get that out of the hands of the capitalists and put it in the hands of the people who need the housing. Anyway, sorry, that is another. We got 3 minutes left. Excellent discussion, and thank everybody who asked questions, contributed, and has attended. It's a bit odd, isn't it, that we're sort of having a discussion about this very important factor, but we're in the midst of the horrendous sights we've seen of the far right, the racists, the attacks, the pogroms in city centres over the last few days. And it may be that so we're coming on to, and obviously people will be organising locally where they are to confront these actions of these scumbags, but our next discussion is going to be about is China socialist in a fortnight, and Ao Long Yu, who was from Hong Kong but is now living in the UK and has written a book, is going to speak to that. But it may be that planning the programme for the next set of discussions, that we want to put that as a topic. Forgive me, the what's happening with the right, the rise of the Reform Party. I don't think that it's a coincidence that Reform became the third most had the third most votes in the general election, and it's encouraged these far right. Oh, Ian Drummond's just appeared just for the last 2 minutes. Well, hi Ian. So I think this might be something we want to put on our list of topics to discuss. It's certainly something that sadly is not going to disappear, and we need to organise and discuss what socialists can do, and how we should respond to these violent attacks, and call them out for what they are. It's racism. It's calling it thuggery. Yvette Cooper is just not enough, is it? Because it's masking what's really behind this. So I'd like to thank everybody, and hope you come to the next one, and think about from this what should a socialist programme for housing be? How do you implement it? How do you actually get to it? Is it possible without getting rid of capitalism? Not to say that you shouldn't be calling for one, don't get me wrong. But yeah, so thank you everybody who has participated. And I know that, for example, Ed Potts, who was on, had to go for work reasons. But thank you, Isaac, very much indeed. And I'll see everybody in, well, I hope so, in a fortnight.